Very good morning to everyone. This is the fifth in the Mastering Holders leading through the Revival series of webinars. I have, as always, a date in the diary for you to put down. This one is available to MIs only, as it's going to be the Mastering Holders AGM. So those Mastering Holders out there, 2 p.m. Thursday the 10th of September, we will be holding a virtual AGM, but we will also have Kate Nichols talking to us. So 2 p.m. Thursday, the 10th of September, MIs only, please put it in your diary. And we also have Kate Nichols talking to us. So today we have a really inspirational session on brand with two people who are really, really at the forefront of this field. You know them because you've seen them speak at our conference. And in fact, I know from looking at the conference feedback over the last few years, the reason we have Robbie, Bargh and Mark Radda on this is because their ratings were so high from the conferences. So without further ado, Mark Radda, over to you.
Thanks very much. What I want to do is talk a little bit about brands before I pass you on to Robbie. And one of the most important things about brands at the moment is that brands are key to your success during this COVID disaster. What's happened with COVID is that COVID has affected everybody. It's affected the hospitality industry worse than anybody. And we found that the value of brands, in fact, a study done recently by Brand Finance saw that $14 billion worth of value had been wiped off the top 50 hotel global brands. That's a massive amount. And one of the key things about brands is that brands are that way of engaging with people who are going through this terrible COVID disaster. What's interesting in the current situation is that people are turning to the familiar. They're turning to things that they trust, things that they know, and brands are part of that. You can see how people have been queuing to go to McDonald's as soon as McDonald's was able to reopen, because they're familiar with that brand. It's really interesting also that people have been contacting old flames and old friends through Facebook throughout COVID. So people are turning to the familiar. And it's really important that as we go through this, you use that familiarity and you reinforce that familiarity and reinforce that difference so that your brand can stand out. And I think before I go into how we can do that, let's just remind ourselves what a brand is. Because brand's not about a logo, it's not about a typeface, it's not about your name, it's about a perception. And the perception that you create in the minds of your consumers, your staff, your stakeholders, and the more consistent you can be with that perception, the more compelling you can make that perception, the more value you will bring. So we need to make sure that we build a perception. And once you have that, then that's expressed everywhere. That creates the experience in your environments, in your products and services, in the way you communicate and your behavior. And there are different brand models that we can use. And the one I prefer to use is this one, where at the center of your brand is a promise. You might have a series of pillars, which are 5 or 6 key assets or signatures that make your hotel different, a set of values that define how you behave, and a personality that defines how you're seen. And if you make the personality something that welcomes people in and people like, then they'll get to know your values, they'll get to know your pillars, they'll get to know your promise. So we need to make sure that we have a clear definition of our brand. But part of the problem we've had in the hotel industry, which I actually spoke about previously, is commoditization. There are more and more hotel brands out there, and more of them are very, very similar. And when we look at the way people communicate, they're using the same images, they're using the same words, the same phrases. They're coming up with very, very generic statements about why they exist. Our mission is to delight and satisfy our guests. I mean, that's not going to differentiate you in the marketplace. So we have this challenge that hotel brands are becoming commodities. And actually COVID has added to that. What we have now is a new focus that's also making more and more commoditization within the hotel brand sector. So safety has become this new focus. People are looking for additional safety measures and hotels are having to implement them. And this statistic here is an interesting one that came from a recent McKinsey study where they looked at what people expected. And people want additional safety measures before they're prepared to go into a hotel. But what was interesting was when we looked at those safety measures, people wanted all of them. There wasn't one that was particularly stronger than any of the others. And actually, when they asked, which ones do you want? They wanted all of them. So safety has become this new focus. But the danger of doing that is if we focus purely on safety, we focus purely on COVID, we forget our brand. Because branding is all about creating an emotional connection with people. And if we forget what that brand is and we forget what makes us different and we start focusing purely on COVID, then we create a far more generic brand and we begin to commoditize ourselves even further. And we have to remember that as we go through this, everything has an impact. So somebody writing a sign, whether they work on reception, whether they work in marketing, whatever they do, that influences the way your brand is perceived. So everything you do in response to COVID, you have to make sure fits with your brand. And an interesting approach was taken by Hilton. I mean, Hilton used COVID, not in a bad way, but as a way of reinforcing what's important to Hilton. They have very strong values, which actually spell the word Hilton. The values are hospitality, integrity, leadership, teamwork, ownership, and now, so they spell Hilton. But what they did was they said, okay, those are our values. How can we reinforce these things during the COVID pandemic? So they did things like lighting up their buildings in support of the NHS. They donated free parking spots. They partnered at American Express to donate overnight stays. They helped staff who'd been furloughed. All of the things they were doing helped to reinforce those values and build their brand. And also they did an interesting thing, which is to develop a sub-brand. And this made a very clear statement of intent. It tackled that safety issue that I spoke about earlier. It showed that they were serious about it and they partnered with other people who were serious about it. And what this brand did was it allowed the Hilton brand to control the COVID brand. So in a way, Hilton was saying, we're in control of this. We have Clean Stay, which is tackling Hilton, tackling COVID. And what that means is that Hilton's strength is reinforced. Rather than it being taken away by COVID, it's saying, look at us, we're in control. So that was a very clever approach. And I think what we need to remember is that people aren't coming to our hotels for a COVID mitigation experience. This isn't about how we get around COVID and how we can bring people back and make them feel safe. They're still coming to us for the same brand experience that we had before. They want the COVID stuff to be dealt with, but they still want the brand experience that they know and love from these familiar hotels. So what we've got to remember is, what is the brand experience that we create? What's the reason for people wanting to come to us? And how can we reinforce that despite COVID? That's the question we should be asking. And we need to be looking at it in two ways. We need to think about the rational things and the emotional things, because brands are about both of those. They're about the rational side, what we get, but they're also about the emotional, which is how people feel as a result. So whilst we're tackling all these rational things for COVID and how we make people feel safe, we need to think about the emotional side of it as well. How is it that people are feeling as a result of staff wearing masks or one-way systems or tables being spread out? How can we create the emotion that makes our brand so special? So let's look at some very practical steps. The first thing is, if you haven't done it already or you haven't revisited it recently, be really clear about the brand you want to create. So what is your promise that you're making to the world? What is it that people will expect from you? The second thing to look at is, what are your brand pillars? What are the 5 or 6 things that you have that make you different? And that might be your location, it might be your architecture, it might be your F&B, it might be the ceremony that you put in place when people arrive. It could be any one of those things. So define what your 5 or 6 brand pillars are. Think about your values, and think about your values beyond the generic ones about trust and innovation and safety. Think about the values that make an experience different. And then think about the personality that you project as a hotel. Once you've done that and you have that very clear definition, and you may have that already, then think about the implications of COVID on that. So think about, for your promise, is your promise still relevant in the post-COVID world? And what does it mean? What about your brand pillars? Are there brand pillars that post-COVID have suddenly become more important? You know, is your garden, the space that you have, now one of your more important pillars than it was before? Are there any values that you need to add post-COVID? Are there things about making sure that people feel loved and engaged? And what about the personality? How can you apply the personality into the new procedures that you're putting in place for COVID? So think about all of those things, but first make sure you have your brand defined, then think about the implications. The second thing is about your people. Your people are your brand. And one of the things that COVID is doing, which is a bad thing, is about taking away that connection that people have with each other. So we need to think very carefully about how we can make the experience something that's not dehumanized because of COVID. You know, people wearing masks and being at distance isn't what we're all about. It's not about hospitality. So how can we create that experience that's very human? So the first thing we do is make sure that people understand the brand we're trying to create, and that involves effective induction. People have been away for a while. You might have a new team, you might have a smaller team. How can we make people understand your brand? How can we apply that values and those personalities to people so that they understand what they should be projecting? How can we think about new ways for them to connect, even if they're wearing a mask and having to stand at a distance? Other ways that we can interact with each other that creates this human connection that we're all about. So we need to focus on people a lot more than we did before, rather than less, even with all the COVID restrictions. The second thing that's a very practical approach is think about your voice. It's still you speaking. If you're having to give information to people, how can you give information to people in a way that reinforces your voice? And make sure that the right people are writing those things, because not everyone can write. Not everyone can write well, anyway. So think about notices, think about communications, think about how that can be given in your voice that's based around your brand and reinforces it. The next thing is about touch points. So we can reinforce our brand at key touch points. So you may have signatures. It might be your afternoon tea as a signature. It might be that you have a particular style of bar that's a signature in your hotel. It might be the ceremony of making a cocktail. Think about how you maintain those signatures in the post-COVID world. Is there a way to do it so that those signatures that are so important to you are still there? Think about how you go about booking and confirmation. Set the expectations of what people might expect when they come to you, but do it in your brand. Think about new processes for arrival. Think about how you can create theatre during dining within new limits. If a beautiful cheese trolley or a pudding trolley is something that's always been something you've done, how can you do that within the new COVID restrictions? Think about departure and think about post-departure and how you can engage and get feedback. So all of those touch points you need to think about based on your brand. You also need to focus on one brand. I think it's really important that you reinforce that this is one brand. Hotels have a tendency to create brands for a lot of things. So you might have a restaurant brand, you might have a brand for your bar, you might have a brand for your event space, all sorts of things. Think about how you can focus on one brand, because it's that brand that's responsible for the COVID experience. So think about how you can prune down your brands to focus on as few as possible, because that creates strength. And the other thing to do is consider what Hilton have done, which is a clever way of saying, look, we're on top of this COVID situation. So consider creating a temporary safe brand, something that highlights your response, that puts people at ease and lets them forget about their worries and reminds staff and guests that you're in control. And also shows that you've taken control of COVID. It's not COVID controlling your brand. So think about whether a temporary safe brand is something you should be doing. And finally, we're in a different world now. But if you've defined your brand, you should then start to look for new opportunities to reinforce that brand. So what have you done that's always been important to you? And is there a way to do that in the post-COVID world? Is there something that you do already that you can do differently in the post-COVID world? Is there something you can do that connects with local communities? And maybe there's a new type of signature that you can create that's unique to you in the post-COVID world. So think about all these opportunities to reinforce your brand. And I think the key thing for this, and I've whizzed through that really, really quickly, the key thing is about being absolutely sure what your brand is, what you stand for, and make sure that's applied. Because it's really important that you don't let COVID define you. You need to be clear about who you are, and you need to reinforce that emotional connection. Because if you can stand for something, then you can stand out despite COVID. So that was a really quick whiz through branding and the implications of COVID on that. So now what I'm going to do is stop sharing my screen, and I shall pass you over to Robbie Bargh, who can talk a little bit more about it from his perspective. So thanks, Robbie. I'll pass you over now.
Full screen. So I'm dialing in from my office in London, please pause. Zoom share. Can you hopefully everyone can see that? Okay. So yeah, thank you, Mark, for that. That was thank you for that. Start video. Hi there, Robbie here. Thank you for that, Mark. So I'm dialing in from London, and just following up from Mark's session, I'd like to talk about your brand, but mainly from a food and drink perspective. How we can really look at making the most of what we have. I think this is really, really important. But I'm going to be looking at, what that looks like from a food and drink perspective. So thank you first of all, thank you for Danny and Georgia for inviting me to take part. This is a great honor, and I'm very, very thrilled to be asked. So when it comes to our brand, I think what's really important is understanding, where people are when it comes to experiences, and what people are talking about. I think this quote from Bain, I think, is really interesting. The client of tomorrow needs to feel protected and safe from the coronavirus, and that's going to be a key part of the experience. But it shouldn't define the whole experience. Now that's really important, and this came out in July from Bain, and obviously they know their stuff. So it's really, really quite important. These are some trends we've seen happening, which I think they're just relevant from a perspective.
Sorry, Robbie, we can't see your presentation.
Oh gosh.
Sorry for interrupting. My apologies, but it's just I know it's so worth seeing that.
Oh, okay, Georgia, can you share it? And then if I just say if you can, because for some reason I can't share it for some reason. Oh God, it's so annoying. Resume share. New share. Okay. Can you see it now?
We can see that.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank
Great.
you so much, Robbie. Sorry to interrupt.
No worries. Okay, so quickly, for the client perspective, this is really, really important, is that Bain made this statement about the client of tomorrow feeling protected from the coronavirus. This thing about, the safety thing is really important, but it can't define the whole experience, which I think is really, really key. These trends, I think, are really interesting, in that what it's shown us is that when it comes to where we've come from, when we start looking at the quality of the experience when it comes to planned visits, we're going to stop going out there and taking, just assuming that we'll get a table. We're going to be thinking about, really, really planning where we're going to go. We're going to be thinking about, more single portions rather than sharing portions. We're going to be thinking about how branded materials and branded goods are more important than unbranded. There's a trust element there. And this whole idea about, rather than having spontaneous visits, we're thinking about planned visits, more slow experiences. So when it comes to, and I know this will come up, when it comes to booking tables, for example, I think it's going to be expected that we leave a deposit, because actually we are creating a much more, 360 experience, and it's a planned thing. It's not just, taken for granted. And I think that's really quite key and quite important when we start talking about what you're doing this evening. So this idea of just having spontaneous experiences is still going to happen, but the whole experience is a lot more considered. And we've all become chefs, we've all become wine connoisseurs. We have an opinion, and so I think this idea of understanding what trends have happened and influenced the way we do has made us realize we do appreciate human connection. But I think when it comes to actually, thinking about what's actually important to us is the whole big experience, not just having food and drink. And I think when you talk about experience, it used to be like customer experience or guest experience was the only way to differentiate your brand among a sea of sameness. Now the challenge is not just to stand out, but to pivot and innovate and transform. And this is really key. I mean, this is a great picture of the Barclay, Barclay Hotel in London, how they've had to really pivot their brand and pivot their concept. This is their restaurant, and they've just turned around this in weeks. They've transformed the dining experience and created something which, makes sense to, takes into consideration all the, the guidelines and the health and safety legislation, but at the same time, they want to give an experience. And I think that's really, really quite important. And then just this past weekend, the press, critics are, they're out there, they're talking about new places. They're talking about, what actually is happening. And they might not be, be casting their critical eye through food and through drink and through experience, but they're talking about proper experiences. So, Faye Mashler has been talking about this new amazing gastropub, and, Jay Rayner has been talking about the coat at home experience, talking about, almost 2/3 of a column dedicated to an experience he has delivered at home. And then we have, Marina McLaughlin talking about, the experience she's had in this fantastic little pop-up shed, this food van, this food truck. And then you've got, people talking about service charge and including it into their operation. And then you have a whole new concept around the bacon naan, the iconic breakfast dish from Dishoom. So we are going through a massive change, and it's really exciting. I know it's quite, it's quite scary, and it's quite, it's quite intimidating. We don't necessarily know what's going to happen, but what we do know is that this is a new beginning. It's a new opportunity. It's a new portal. It's a metamorphosis, and we need to really think about how we can reinvent and reposition, our food and drink concepts, our brands. And I think we need to think about really reimagining this experience and what that looks like. And I know that this is quite scary, but we have to take advantage of the situation, and something good is going to come out of this. So it's quite exciting. When we talk about brands, and Mark talks about promise, which is really, really important in that what your brand brings to the world. We've also got to think about purpose. What your brand does for the world, and and that's really becoming just as important as your promise. And I think that's kind of key in that, this is not about, what we look like necessarily or what we can do. It's what you can do for me, how a guest or how a person feels. So what does your brand actually do for the world? And then this idea about, how we can create something based on your values. And your values have to come through everything you do, whether, through the way your team are trained, the way your food is presented, the way your design, occurs, your rooms, your experiences in rooms, your arrival, everything. But also now is the time to really think about the value you add to the guest experience. And that's really, really quite key. Added value and being perceived as good value is going to be so much more important. And people will, they will smell something if it's not right. It's not about smoke and mirrors. That they will want to know where your food comes from, and how purchasing works, and it will have to be very transparent. So I think value is absolutely really, really key. And then coming up with a big idea. What is your philosophy? What's your vision? What do you stand for from a food and drink perspective? And then we can't forget those key sort of, the P's as such, the product, what is your food story? What's your drink story? How relevant is that today to that audience, your people? And Mark talks about, the importance of people. They are your ambassadors. How do we look after the people? They are how do they bring to life the brand experience? How do they bring to life the purpose? And then thinking about positioning, everything from identity, look and feel, tone of voice, how you're communicating your brand, and remembering who you're communicating to. And then the environment. How does your environment make people feel? Not necessarily how it looks. We all have opinions on how things look when it comes to design, but how it makes you feel. And that's really, really quite key. How does it make a guest feel? And that is how it makes a guest feel on a Monday night in January when it's raining, not just on a Thursday night in November. So I think those are really, really quite key to deliver the whole big experience. And I like to measure this in how much emotion can you get per square foot, rather than think about it from a sales perspective. How much emotion can you actually get from that particular, that piece of that corner in your bar, or that area in your lounge? How much emotion? And that emotion will translate into repeat business. People will talk about it, and obviously, it will generate revenue, but also profit. But the three other things we have to think about today is, not only all those brand elements, but we've also got to think about how we can pivot and innovate and transform our spaces and our brands into something, very quickly if we need to. So COVID cannot define your brand. We need to stand out for something much bigger and stand out. For something bigger than that. These images here on the left is the pig, and I thought they'd done an amazing job in coming out and really standing out and having an opinion and standing for something really, really important. Their opening week and dedicating rooms and spaces and food and drink experiences to NHS and frontline workers was a great initiative. Really, really amazing. And they stood for something. So they have great purpose. So when it comes down to product, people, positioning, environment, let's take a look at how important this is. So let's look at some great examples. And you see on this slide here, we've got Citizen M, we've got Refuge at the Principal Manchester, we've got the Goring, we've got Lock Hotels, and we've got Otka Hotels as well. We've got to start thinking about product, people, positioning, and environment. So from a product point of view, I've taken some examples and shown you who's doing it really, really well. So the Ned. Okay, let's look at the Ned. They've got 8 or 9 spaces, experiences under one roof. They really understand their audience. They really understand that product. You go into those spaces and you can have 8 or 9 different experiences. You can be Pan Asian or Californian kitchen or Great British. They really understand, what that product is, what their audience is, and they adapt their product for the audience. They really know their audience very, very well. They represent great value. They bring to life the values of the Ned through their food and drink experience. Smart system. Now is the time to really look at your supply chain, really look about, are you really now going to start buying, from those suppliers which are based, 1,000 miles away, or can we work with that local farm a little bit smarter? Let's really think about, now is the time to really look about supply chains and think about doing it well. And then really, really importantly, you cannot look at your product through the eyes of just a hotelier. You've got to look through it through a different lens. How important, how relevant is your product to your local area? Being relevant locally is so important. Being, representing goodwill in your neighborhood is so important. How can you do that with your product? So don't necessarily think about your bedrooms. That's really, really important, but also think about what other audiences can you bring into your property. And I think that's really, really quite key. So let's look through it in that way. Refuge does really well. Refuge is a great, bar, restaurant, 12,500 square feet at the Principal in Manchester. And they really know their audience. They know their tribes. They've created this really great multicultural tapa concept, music and drink, and they understand that product. Manchester loves food and drink. It's a very social city. So they're bringing a very social product. And we talked about the pig. And then I saw this tweet last week came through. The Michelin guide, the guys popped in from Michelin, popped into the Wigmore, and they had a great experience. They had, they had some great chips. They had, a great toasty, a very signature toasty. Their pie, and they had a great ale. It's not just about beer in a pub. Isn't it nice that the Michelin guys can actually go to the Wigmore, which is a nice pub, an F&B concept, a food drink concept attached to the Langham? It's the 5-star luxury property, has an amazing pub, and the Michelin are talking about the pub. They really, it's a really nice way of actually showcasing your product. People, we cannot get away from the fact that culture comes from the top. So, it has to come right from the very top. And, I love Sally Beck's sort of initiative about creating the happiest hotel, in London. How cool and how important and how relevant that is. Let's really think about what we do with our teams. I love the way Citizen M has this very flat line approach in that it has a crew, and the crew are they're cross-trained, they are empowered, they take ownership of things. They have one hotel manager and then a crew of 24 people, and that 24 people do everything. Not all these roles and specifications about what you do and what your responsibilities are. They own things. They take ownership. And a really great credit for them is, they've got over 20 hotels in Europe. And I think 6 or 7 of those hotels actually are run by hotel managers who started off as crew members in Bankside and the first Citizen M, which opened in London. Dishoom, one of the best companies out there, to work for in the UK, and Hawksmoor as well. Their culture, emotional intelligence, how you get your people to bring to life your brands, really, really important. And that more, in this COVID world, we realize human connection is so much more important than it was before. So people can have, go and cook their own steak and have a nice bottle of wine, but they want that human connection. The people in your business are really important people to bring to life your brand. So let's not forget that. Positioning, we've already talked this a little bit, really understand your brand, create a strong brand identity, really think about your audience, talk to your audience the way they want to be talked to. Don't necessarily talk to them the way a hotelier would talk to them. Botanica, a project we were fortunate to work on, at South Lodge, that whole experience is really, focused towards not just hotel guests, but spa members. They really understand how they talk to their guests from a member's perspective. Wild Honey, St. James, Wild Honey was a great restaurant in Soho. Sofitel St. James, had a space, an opportunity. They wanted to, Wild Honey was losing their lease. They put them together. And then suddenly we've got a hotel which talks to its guests and talks to its neighborhood as a restaurateur would talk to them. And suddenly, from a positioning point of view, we've got a very, very strong, story being told within a hotel. So tone of voice, this is Fritz and Felix. It's got a great menu. Who'd have thought this menu is almost designed like a comic book? It just won one of the best wine lists from Decanter last week in Europe, and it's located in a very traditional 5-star luxury property in Baden-Baden. So really understanding your audience, really understanding about audience beyond the hotel, and then talk to them in the right way. So, through tone of voice, through identity, through collateral, digital, as well as, you've really got to understand who they are, and then really focus how you talk to them in that way. Environment. This is about not necessarily how it looks, but how it makes a guest feel. So when it comes to the Goring, for example, when we started working with the Goring, Jeremy Goring said to us, I want to create a sexy bar for that new luxury guest. And that, luxury guest not necessarily stays in the property, but actually wants to come to the property. And that's really important. So we couldn't alienate the guests who use the Goring bar and the lounge in the daytime, because they're usually regulars or guests staying in the property, staying in the hotel. So we wanted to bring in an audience to come in the evening. Now, to do that, we had to create an environment which made that work. So that was all about lighting and music and a back bar, a proper drinks list, a whole experience. When you sit there at 11 o'clock in the morning, you feel really comfortable and cozy and looked after. But then in the evening, it feels like, this is the sexiest bar around. You want to be part of that. So really think about your environment and your setting, and how that you bring that to life, how you make your guests feel. Ham Yard, a really great example, is that how you, in Ham Yard, that all their their food and drink stories, the bar, the bowling alley, the rooftop, the orangery, they all talk to the local area, the people working and living in Soho. And now it's important to really think about that. And outside area is so important. Everyone's really thinking about this in COVID times. What can we possibly do? Really think, we've got to think about the flexibility of using your space in a very different way. This is not about creating spaces which just look good. This is about creating spaces which make people feel good. Pivot, we can't forget. We've got to be agile enough to survive. I love the way that the Dorchester did this afternoon tea delivered in a box. Jean-Georges did the pizza to go. At Covent Garden, thinking about the dinner party at home. We have to think as entrepreneurs. We can't just rely on people, on brand initiative from head office. We've got to get out there and really look at this and make it work for ourselves. So if we've got to pivot what we do as a brand, then we need to do so. Innovation. We've got some brilliant brands doing some brilliant stuff out there. Pilgrim. I love Pilgrim. Is a tiny little hotel, next generation property, in Paddington. They really realized that if they're going to survive during this COVID time, they had to really think about what they were doing, how they could be of service and how they could represent goodwill in their community. Takeaway, creating a provision store, which is great coffee. How can they do that in a traditional sort of hotel environment, a setting? They really thought about what that was. Molly's, how you can look at, this American diner and really pimp it up and really think about what that you could represent. So they've got a drive-through during COVID times is perfect. Really thinking about what that does. So really innovating the experience of staying in a property. Birch, which is just opening or just opened at the moment, it's almost disguised as a sort of festival disguised as a hotel. Really thinking about this idea of a lifestyle retreat, where you can go there to eat and drink, be a member. You can have facilities where you can treat it like a festival. But it's got its own bakery. It really thinks about its setting, its location, and the people it wants to attract. This is more than a hotel with rooms with F&B. It's much more than that. And then a property like Great Scotland Yard, where there are so many different stories in different spaces. So again, appealing to different guests. So they've got all these different little brand stories happening under one roof. So really think about how you can innovate what you're doing. So to summarize, when you're looking at your brand, when you're thinking about what we're creating from a food and drink perspective, you've got to really think about, we phase it in sort of what is that discovery piece? Really think about what your values or your brand positioning are, what's your purpose, what's your promise. Think about your commercials. What is your strategy? How do you future-proof this? And then you define, you come up with all that, and then you have to come up with your big idea, your concept, your story. What is that? What does that look like? What's going to set you apart from the rest? But it's got to have a strategy in mind as well. So, what's the big story from a food story, a drink story? And then how do you develop that? Menus, menu engineering, pricing strategy. And then how do you work with your design teams to make people not just create a space which looks amazing, but it makes our guests feel amazing. And that's not just a guest who's staying in the hotel, but the guests who are using it. And then really think about your positioning, your socials, your PR, your marketing. You can't forget this. People, you might have the best products in the world, the best, but you have to talk about it. You've got to, have a plan in place. You've got to think about what your PR and what your marketing looks like, what your socials are, what your digital looks like. Photography, have amazing photography. Why? Really think about getting all that lined up, and then delivery. So don't sort of, fall at that last hurdle. Training and development, dry runs, soft openings, PR, really. And if it's not right, things are not right in the concept, change it, refine it. But those are the key stages you have to get really through. And that's my summary. I hope that makes sense.
Robbie, that's absolutely amazing. Thank you so much, Mark. Absolutely amazing. Can I just say, for all the people listening, there's a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. I've had a few questions sent in advance, but please feel free to ask questions. I'm going to ask a couple I've seen already. So, Mark, you talk about sub-brand, about cleaning, even if you're an independent. Well, I'll rephrase that. You talked about sub-brand. Hilton are quite a big uh, a conglomerate, or whatever you want to call them. A lot of our listeners are independents.
Yes.
Would you advise a sub-brand for independents?
I think a temporary sub-brand is quite a good way just to reinforce that you've tackled the COVID situation and to reinforce that safety issue. I wouldn't recommend it's something that stays around forever, but over the next sort of 3 to 6 months, I think it's a very valuable thing to show that and to demonstrate your seriousness. And what it does is it emphasizes your brand, it puts your brand first and then says, our brand is tackling this. So it's a great way to make a statement. But what I wouldn't do is make it something that becomes there forever. It's here to reassure people as we move back to some new normality. But I think it's a good idea.
Okay, thank you. And Robbie, I mean, both of you were very, very clear on COVID can't define your brand, and I think that's been one of the really valuable insights. But Robbie, you were talking about environment at a point, and environment, in a way, social distancing and the requirement to physically lay your room out differently.
Yeah.
Is that not going to define environment, or what advice would you give around that?
It's part of it, but it shouldn't be defined by it completely. I mean, I went to a great restaurant, a Michelin star gastro pub, in Kent over the weekend, and they just used more of their space. They actually did, I think 10-20% less covers than would normally do from a sitting, and they staggered the room. People sitting down really brilliantly, and they would make guests aware of the fact constantly that when they were coming in, they would have to put an exact time. I think that the meter rule, thank God, the meter rule is sort of, and it's not 2 meters because it makes a huge difference. You can't, I think we can get through it. Absolutely. I don't think you need to make it look like a barren wasteland. You actually can do it. But I think what's key is control and staggering. And also it doesn't stop you from doing things like lighting and, and music and making sure that we're still telling a story. It's not necessarily how a room looks. It's how a room makes a guest feel when they walk in and when they arrive, and whether that's the whole sort of, sanitizer moment, what actually happens with that smile, that whole thing about what that journey looks like has to be really think about. But you've got to think about it from a guest perspective, and it can't be based on what a room looks like. It's purely got to be about how a guest feels comfortable, and safe, but also that they're having a great time. They're excited. They've still got to feel like, butterflies in their tummy moment when they walk in. They're coming for a vibrant, a wonderful experience. They could have had food at home. They could have had safe food at home, but they're not coming for that. They're coming for something much more. And that human connection and that experience, that 360 approach is really, really key to this.
Okay. Being the very practical lot that hoteliers are, I'm going to ask you both this question. The number one question I've had beforehand is the government have been sending out messages, and one of them has been around VAT and reduction in VAT. How would you say hoteliers should react to that, given that the consumers might have a certain perspective on it? Mark, if I start with you and then lead on to Robbie.
Okay. I think one of the interesting things, and we've seen a few people in the hospitality industry saying that they're going to reduce their prices and give the VAT back to their consumers. And obviously they can afford to do that. Not everyone can afford to do that. What that does do is it shows a sense of generosity and a sense of understanding that the consumers are in a tricky situation as well. But I think if everyone does it, then it devalues that. And I don't think it's expected of everybody to hand over the money. So I think it's really up to the particular company and the particular brand. I think it's a way of making a statement about you understand how people feel, but it's not the only way you can do that. And I think to many consumers, actually having hotels and hospitality there and still being able to use them is far more important than getting a bit of money off their meal or their stay. But it is an option that you could do.
Robbie?
I think my heart says this is the goodwill, and we should be pushing it forward, and we should be passing it on to our guests. But at the end of the day, if we don't have a business, because we don't have the money to have a business, then it's pointless. So I think it's got to come down to the individual businesses. If they can afford to do it, absolutely. If they can add value and enhance the experience in a different way, then great. But I think being transparent is really, really key and really important. People don't want to be sort of discover little things halfway through an experience. They need to know. So as long as you're very transparent about things. But I think it's going to come down to business. It's the individual businesses. If they can afford to do it, pass it on, great. But if they can't, I can understand.
There's also an issue if we start to discount now, then it's much, much harder to put your prices up afterwards. And discounting now will affect the perception of your brand. So if you want your brand to be a premium one, suddenly giving away the VAT back to people actually will devalue your brand. So that's another consideration, I think.
It's adding value and adding wow to the experience, which is really key, really important.
Rather than discounting, Robbie, is that what you're saying?
Adding value is something rather than discounting something. The word discounting shouldn't really exist in this context. We've got to add value to the guest experience, and that's really, really key. But we've also got to look after the business.
Okay, another question which has just come in from David Morgan Hewitt, who's probably going to be very happy as you gave a nice plug for the Goring, Robbie. But also it's been interesting, this has come up a lot over the weekend, and this is about depositing and no-shows. Obviously in post-COVID times with reduced capacities, no-shows have really hurt a lot of the businesses that have opened. So I'll start with Mark and then move on to Robbie. Your views on depositing for food and beverage.
I think deposits are something that people will understand is necessary in the industry, and I think if it's communicated in the right way, saying we're creating a new experience for you, we now in this new world we now expect to have a deposit up front. I think that's absolutely fine, provided it's communicated in a way that's on brand. So I think because so many changes are happening, now is actually a really good time to bring that into place so that people come to expect it. And it can be done in a nice way, in the way that you communicate it and explaining why it's important to the hotel and why it's important to the restaurant and the benefits that will bring both the restaurant and the consumer. So I think it's a really sensible thing to start doing, and it can be done in a branded way.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I would say, we are all as guests really planning where we're spending, where we're going out for lunch or for dinner. And no matter, I used to drop into restaurants all the time saying, can I come and have something to eat? Now I wouldn't dream of doing that. So I'm thinking really where I'm going to eat, drink, and booking tables. And so I think, one would expect that. And also going back to the trends, we have seen people are going to be expecting a slower experience, a more meaningful experience when it goes to eating and drinking. So I think when it comes to booking tables, it will be expected. And it will, if people are asked to leave a deposit, as they would do when they're going to the theatre, then that is fine. I don't think it's a problem. But you've got to do it in the right way. We have to be, we have to conduct ourselves as our brand would. Go through our filter as a guest. Go through our filter with our guest in mind, not as not as a branded hotelier from a big corporate brand. And we've got to, hospitality. We've got to be hospitable. We've got to be emotional. We've got to, how would we like to be spoken to? And also really think about what you say in print, because what you say in print has to resonate with the emotion side inside of you. It can't be just blunt guidelines and rules. We don't want rules. We want, you need to state the case and why you're doing this in an emotional way, and guests will be fine with it. They really, really will. I'm absolutely sure about it.
So if you've got one bit of advice that can't be COVID can't define your brand, because I think you've both got that message through really clearly, but to the hoteliers listening and the wider audience, when I'm sure this is going to be shared hugely, Mark, your one bit of advice to hoteliers in this post-COVID times?
If it can't be, don't let COVID define your brand. I guess my piece of advice is remember both the rational and the emotional sides of the experience. So if you're putting rational changes in to deal with COVID, make sure you think about the emotional impact of that and how people will feel, because that feeling is what makes your brand special. And it's very, very easy to focus on the rational, but it's easy also to forget the emotional. So always remember both sides of the equation. That's my piece of advice.
Fantastic. Robbie?
I would just say, don't look at everything through the lens of a hotelier. Look at your lens through a lens of opening it up this. Think about how you're going to make yourself locally relevant, and really think about who those audiences are. And really, when you're thinking about the audience, look at everything you do, from your products, your positioning, your design, everything, your people piece, your culture piece, all through the eyes of that guest, that audience. Emotion per square foot. How do we bring to life amazing experiences for your audience? And if that audience is your neighbors and people who work in your neighborhood, then really think about that really carefully, because this is not everyone who's just staying upstairs in a bedroom. This is way, way beyond. So it's a great opportunity to really repurpose our spaces and think about who they're for, what these experiences are for, and who they're for.
Mark, Robbie, really, really inspirational. And I think just what everybody needed to hear. Thank you so much. For everyone listening, this is going to be shared on the Mastering Holders YouTube channel very shortly. Thank you all for listening. Thank you very much, gentlemen, and wishing everybody a successful reopening, or those that already open, even more successful next few weeks and months. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Danny. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you.